Hi, everybody. Russ Barkley here. And today in this lecture, I'd like to focus a little more on the problems of ADHD and emotional dysregulation, or what I have come to call emotional incontinence, because of the significant role that impulsivity plays in the emotional expression and emotional difficulties that people with ADHD seem to have. So this is a sort of a continuation of my earlier lecture on emotion, but I want to go into it in more detail and suggest not only how we can understand emotional responses, but also what individuals might be able to do about them. So why don't we get started? Let's, of course, as always, tee up our presentation in PowerPoint, and let's begin. So, ADHD has been known to be affiliated with difficulties with emotion regulation and expression, going back to the very first paper on ADHD in the 1770s by Melchior Weichert in his medical textbook in Germany, where he talked about what today we would call adult ADHD. And in those descriptions that he provided, he mentions the difficulties with emotional expression, perhaps not in that way or in that term, but certainly he talks about the problems with regulating emotion. And then throughout the history, we see reference to emotional dysregulation going in George Still's papers in 1902. He made it, in fact, the central feature of his description of what today we would call ADHD. Later on through that century, into the work of Paul Wender in the 1970s, who was one of the first to talk about the emotional behavioral problems of adults with ADHD, and then all the way up to about 14 years or so ago when I began writing reviews of emotion and ADHD to convince colleagues that this was, in fact, a central feature of ADHD. As you know, the link of ADHD to emotion kind of got lost from 1968 all the way up to about 2010 to 2013 because of the DSM. The DSMs did not include problems with emotion regulation as a feature of ADHD. Or if it made any mention of it, it was kind of as a comorbidity, perhaps due to oppositional disorder or maybe depression or anxiety. But that was about it. It wasn't really a core feature of the disorder. But beginning about 14 years ago, I and others began to write about the need to put emotion back into our way of thinking about ADHD because it wasn't there in our clinical diagnostic manual. And since then, I'm happy to say that the field has embraced the evidence, which is abundant, on the importance of emotion in understanding and managing ADHD. And now we see it all over the place in various clinical papers, chapters, the trade media on the importance that emotional dysregulation plays in ADHD. So today just want to talk a little bit more about that. Emotional self-regulation can be conceptualized into these steps, more or less. This is based on Gross's modal model of emotion. But first of all, there is the ability to inhibit inappropriate emotional behavior that may be being provoked by various provocative events in the environment. So the ability to inhibit strong, negative, or even positive emotion in individuals, that is part of the human capacity for response inhibition. And of course, we know that adults and children with ADHD will have significant problems with that first step because impulsivity is part of ADHD, and so impulsive emotions we would expect to be part of ADHD. The second part of emotional self-control is if a strong emotion is elicited, whether or not we express it or not, we're still experiencing the emotion. The individual has the capacity to engage in self-calming, self-soothing, and otherwise down-regulating the strong physiological arousal and reaction to the event. That's the self-control, self-regulation part of emotional self-regulation. Also comes with it the ability to shift our attention, to refocus it away from the provocative event towards something more neutral. And by interrupting the connection to the event, we hope to quell the strong emotion faster than otherwise would be the case if we kept engaging with that emotional stimulus. So this is sort of involving distraction, refocusing, and even reappraising the event. And then finally, the ability to organize new emotions to substitute for the ones that were being provoked. These will be calmer, more moderated, and they will be more consistent with our goals and our longer term welfare. So that's how we understand emotional self regulation. And of course, we know that ADHD disrupts all of those steps. It involves strong and impulsive emotion, so that emotions are being elicited or expressed more quickly when they're provoked, more strongly when they're provoked. And we see this through not just the poor inhibition and suppression, but through low frustration tolerance, quickness to be impatient, quickness to anger and become hostile, easily aroused, more emotionally excitable, reactive. There's just a lot more raw emotion coming out of ADHD. And what I have come to call emotional incontinence because of this just rapid expression or release of emotion that is seen. I borrowed that term, by the way, from a Hollywood movie with Paul Giamatti. No need to go into that, but I just, when I heard it, loved the term for capturing this aspect of impulsive expression, the unregulated expression of strong emotions as they're being provoked in the environment. And I think the word incontinence kind of captures this utter lack of control that's going on here. And then, of course, we would expect to see people with ADHD having difficulties with the self-regulating aspect. Now that the emotion is up, out, and being expressed so strongly, can you get control of it again? Can you recapture your typical behavior? Can you downregulate and moderate your emotions when provoked? And we, of course, have seen in children and adults that they're more deficient in this effortful, cognitive, top-down ability to get control of themselves, to self-calm, self-soothe, refocus, distract themselves in other ways, get back to a typical, more moderate response. And then, of course, we also find that they have difficulties inducing alternative, positive emotional states that might help to downregulate, quell, even replace the strong emotion with something more acceptable, perhaps positive, but at least neutral in its expression. So we see both of these stages involved in ADHD, the emotional impulsive incontinent reaction and the difficulties with getting control over the emotions once they've been expressed. Now, we can understand the emotional behavior that's going on here by breaking it into its 5 steps. And although these 5 parts can occur very rapidly in the human brain and, of course, in human behavior, Gross has distinguished the steps so that we can understand them better and perhaps understand how to intervene with them more. So first, there is the situation or the context in which we find ourselves. Nothing real problematic there other than the setting may be more or less likely to contain emotionally provocative events to us. So let's think about that for a minute. The setting may not seem important to you, but it may increase or decrease the probability that emotional events might occur. Then there is the provocative event itself, all right? The instance that happens, the stimulus, if you will, that is going to bring out the strong emotion eventually. So something happens that probably is going to be very strongly valued, has a valence of one way or another, positive or negative for us. Now, very quickly, the brain appraises that event. This is where the emotion is coming from. There's a subconscious level of emotional processing and then a conscious level of appraisal. But the human brain is designed to appraise events very quickly for their threat to us or their promise of reward and to react relatively quickly to that. And then we put on top of that subconscious appraisal, a more cognitive, slower brain, if you will, like Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, his book, this would be the executive reappraisal of the event going on here. And then, of course, there's the emotional response that comes out of us, both physiologically and behaviorally in our expression to that event. And that, of course, will be followed by certain consequences to us for having emoted. So that's a nice 5-step way of understanding the sequence through which we go through when we have an emotional response. Now, it also helps us to understand how we can manage our emotions better. What could we do behaviorally, psychologically, medically in order to offset this problem with strong emotion? Well, the first one is obvious, and that is to start thinking about our life and do we find ourselves in situations repeatedly that keep giving us these provocative emotional events? If so, and there's something common about them, can we take steps to avoid that situation? If you find yourself going into the same bar every Friday after work, but you know there's some other people who hang out there who are going to be very provocative toward you, maybe victimize you, but certainly start throwing strong provocative events at you, then maybe you need to pick a different place to go after work where these people aren't going to be found. So we need to think a little bit. This is kind of a contemplative, reflective forethought about what is bringing out our strong emotion in certain situations, and could we choose to change those situations in some way, alter the context? The second thing is we find ourselves already in the situation and the provocative event is occurring. So, what can we do then? We can interrupt our attention, distract ourselves, look away, look up, cover our eyes, look down, or in some other way go to our happy place, if you will, but distract ourselves away from this provocative event by distracting ourselves or precluding looking at it by what children do, cover their eyes, close their eyes. Then we are terminating the connection to the event. And hopefully, by doing that, we will get control of our emotion faster. The emotional expression will run its course more quickly, and then we can get control of it again. So, sometimes what we can teach people to do or teach ourselves to do is how to distract and otherwise preclude continuing attending to the provocative event. It's not always easy, but it can be done in some ways. A third way of intervening is at the next step of appraisal, where while we can't necessarily intervene with the subconscious aspect of emotional evaluation of an event, this appraising that our brain does so quickly, that fight or flight reaction, we can use the executive brain on top of that to reappraise the event. Is it really that important? Is it really that negative? Is it really that problematic? This is where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. So I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but cognitive therapists focus on this stage of getting you to track your thoughts, track your appraisals, and change the way you think about things. And by altering the way you think, what you say to yourself, and how you think about the event, you can alter your subsequent emotional reactions to those events. So that's kind of the third thing you can do. The fourth thing we can do is to try to suppress the event. We see children doing this when they sit on their hands, when they cover their mouth, when they close their ears and look away. They're trying to suppress the expression of the event. It's not very effective. This is a very difficult stage to do because the emotion's been elicited, and now we're gritting our teeth and we're clenching our fists and so on. But it is certainly something that one can do. And by the way, this is where medications come in. The ADHD medications, stimulants, non-stimulants, antihypertensive alpha 2 drugs, all work in one way or another to affect the limbic emotional brain, and thereby alter the expression of the emotion or even make it a lot less likely that it's even going to be elicited. So medical intervention can take place here as well. And then finally, of course, we can alter the emotion by altering the consequences for it. Now, this won't change the current emotion, but by changing the consequences that follow that emoting, we are altering the future probability of that emotion, either increasing or decreasing that. This is a little harder to do. This is what behaviorism does by altering contingencies, altering consequences, behavioral interventions such as we do with oppositional children, are trying to alter the future likelihood that that event happens again. So you can see then that there are at least 5 different steps at which an individual could intervene if they're having difficulties with emotional dysregulation or what I call emotional incontinence, and perhaps get better control over that, including, if necessary, the use of ADHD medications to help manage strong emotion. So I hope that helps you to understand the difficulties with emotion that go with ADHD, and more importantly, gives you some ideas to think about as to how you might be able to better regulate these emotional symptoms. So thanks everybody for joining me. Again, as I always say, recommend us to others if you like the information here. Please subscribe if you're not a subscriber. And please join me again in a few days for another video on ADHD. Thanks everybody and be well.